Hello and welcome to this short presentation for Small Scale and Craft Business Program. My name is Jackie Broman and I'm talking about legal matters in this presentation for your growth of your small scale or craft business. I run a law firm based in Central Victoria. I'm originally from Wangaratta. My offices are at Nagambie, Romsey and Wallen. I am an accredited specialist in wills, estate planning and succession planning. So that's one of the logos that you see on the screen. But I also wanted to put something on this slide that showed that, you know, lawyers are also humans. And that's very much what my presentation is about today as well. As you grow, not only what you have to be aware of or think of in terms of legal advice, but how to find that legal advice and how to find someone to trust. So a couple of my favorite hobbies there on the screen. I've got a couple of kelpies and just spend as much time with them outdoors as I can. And I do love to fish as well. So occasionally we mix the two and the dogs come out fishing, particularly on the ocean. They do love seeing whales in particular. So it's pretty special. So getting straight into it, having your structure right is very important for your business. Your structure can change over time, so don't worry. If you started as a sole trader or as a partnership, which is quite common when you start growing your hobby into a business, that's a great starting point. And I often say a rule of thumb is probably $300,000 or $400,000 in income, and then you maybe need to start looking at a different structure, also depending on advice from your accountant as well. There are a lot of different objectives that you might have to consider when you're looking at your structure. Tax is one of them, and that's where your accountant comes in. Other things might be control, asset protection, and how to be able to split income out. So lots of things to consider, but your next step up might be something like a company, or looking at either a family trust if you're in business with your family, or a unit trust if you're in business with friends. The other thing that happens as our businesses grow is that we do more and more transactions. So the more transactions you have, the more contracts you're entering into. So having really clear terms of trade can be important. That is direct with your customers, but then also having written agreements with your suppliers, or having an understanding of what the terms are of your agreement with your supplier. A lot of this can avoid disputes because if it's set down in writing, and also there is a component in your agreement that says, well, what happens if you have a dispute and you're required to follow a particular process, it can take out a lot of stress and expense from the situation. It can also help clear up any debt collection issues, because if your terms of trade are clear with the people that you're providing product to, and they clearly breach your terms of trade, there is something you can do about it. But if your terms of trade are not clear, it is much more difficult to enforce. The other thing to realise as well is, as small businesses, you do have some protections under the consumer law. So consumer law was extended from just consumers to also small businesses in the situation where a small business is dealing with big business. So either if you are getting components from a big business, or you are supplying a big business, it might be like starting to go into some of the large supermarkets. When big businesses require you to sign a standard form contract and you are not able to negotiate, if there are unfair terms in that contract, you have protections as a consumer. So that is also an interesting way of being able to have legal support without it costing a lot of money, because your state consumer protection in Victoria, it's Consumer Affairs, will often offer a free dispute resolution process. As you grow, you may also be moving out of the garage at home into premises. Whether it's a direct lease or whether it's a sublease, there are terms to that. You should get something in writing. As a retail provider, there are special conditions for retail tenants. But the thing to know as well is if you haven't entered into a retail lease before, they are very different from a residential lease. You don't have as many protections, and you also have obligations to pay and maintain the property far more than a residential premises. You might be bringing in employees or potentially subcontractors, and so having agreements for those arrangements is also important, and understanding the difference between the two and when a subcontractor actually should be a employee, and then also understanding the laws around employing people and your obligations, and also what insurances are required when you start doing that. Also interesting for those innovating and creating new and interesting products is the intellectual property that you are developing. So we look around our businesses and we see tangible assets, but quite often our intangible assets that we're developing get forgotten about. This can sometimes be particularly valuable. Now, you're required to trade under a business name in Australia, but registering your business name does not protect it. It's not like protecting a brand. There are some difficulties about someone trying to register a similar name, but it doesn't mean that someone can't just adopt that name and put up a Facebook page and start using it if they're not trading. A trademark is an actual protection. It's an intellectual property registration, and it protects your brand. And your brand is more than your business name. It is often a logo. It is often the look and feel of your packaging. It's often colors and fonts and images. You may also be developing particular genetics in a product that you're developing. If you're growing yourself, you might be creating special processes. There might be something that you can apply for a patent for. This is another way of protecting what you develop. It's also important to remember that even though in small business we're often told from a marketing perspective to share and be authentic and show people behind the scenes, that can often do away with some of your ability to protect your intellectual property. Because as you develop your intellectual property, your processes and the special things that are valuable in your business, if you're sharing them, it might be determined by the bodies that take these registrations that it's not special, that it is not private. If you've made it public, you may have lost your rights to protect. Plant breeders' rights are also interesting, again, for those who are actually growing themselves. If you are developing something special over time, you might be able to have a plant breeder's right, which is a different sort of intellectual property. Again, it would be interesting if you are a grower to have a look into what has happened with the Pink Lady apple, because the people who developed that did not get protections that they should have. And then finally, to close out this short presentation, how do you go about finding a lawyer that you're comfortable with, getting the advice you need, and how much should you be spending? So you can find lawyers who charge fixed fees, get them to give you a quote just like another service provider would. So you go to a mechanic, you have them quote you, and if the scope changes, they have to call you to tell you if something changes and what the cost would be. So you can find lawyers that work that way. It's also important to find a lawyer that can do what you need them to do. There are a lot of lawyers who do a lot of general work. But as I explained at the start, I have a specialist accreditation. And so there are specialist lawyers in all sorts of areas. Often you pay a little bit more potentially for a specialist up front, but you're more likely to get the result that you need as well. Sometimes when you do go to a lawyer who is more of a generalist, it might take them longer, even though they charge a smaller hourly rate. So it might sometimes end out the same, if not more, particularly if you're paying for them to learn along the way. So just be aware that the skill level of lawyers differs. A lawyer might put up on their website that they have a whole list of things that they can do, but in fact, their skill, the depth of their skill in each of those things is not as deep as an expert. In terms of budget, I think that if you're spending about $2,000 a year on your accountant, you should do about the same on your lawyer. And for example, if a terms and conditions or a lease costs maybe about $700 or $800 to review, then you can look at 2 different legal documents every year, 2 or 3 things chipped off your list of things as your business grows. There are lots of alternatives to actually having work with a lawyer directly. You can get a lot of legal document templates online now. And yes, they're a great starting point and can serve you well up to a point. So it's a good place to start. It's better to have something than nothing. Also, in terms of dispute resolution, as I mentioned before, Consumer Affairs can be a great place to help with dispute resolution. There's also a small business ombudsman, and there is a small business commissioner in Victoria that offers dispute resolution at free or low cost if you do need that sort of service. And finally, how do you actually find a lawyer? Well, I mean, Google can be a good place to start, but there are legal databases. Particularly in Victoria, you would use the Law Institute of Victoria. Lawyers with membership to the Law Institute tend to keep up to date better, have more resources available to them. So I would, like you would do potentially with looking into any other service provider that you would use locally, like a hairdresser or someone to fix your car, you would have a look on their website. You might, for a professional, also have a look at them on LinkedIn, see what sort of recommendations you have around. You don't necessarily have to go to someone close and local to you these days. With COVID, we now know that you can pretty much work with anyone in the world from anywhere. So don't be confined to having to walk down the street to your local if that's not the most appropriate. So I hope that that's helpful. I was keeping it short and sweet. Here are my contact details if you want to. I'm happy if you reach out to me via email just to ask any quick questions or even guidance as to where to start or to get a referral. So I hope to hear from you, and I hope that this short presentation adds to your toolkit as a good starting point about what to be thinking about as your business grows.